I know why those windows are open over there because of COVID and because of singing. And I love to hear the children's voices. I think I just saw someone go down but they're outside, man. You gotta let the kids play. So we'll just manage it up here. It's good to see everybody. This story that Sarah shared this morning is an old one that some of you have heard. It's really an analogy of how we see God, right? That we all see God from many different perspectives, and we touch God, touch spirit, touch life from many different perspectives, and from that we have our own descriptions. That's what that story was all about. And it's true. I often think about the Unitarian Francis David in the 16th century. He said this a long time ago. He said, "We need not think alike to love alike." And that is something we're still grappling with in our nation. And this morning, I want to talk somewhat about that. I think I got a good sermon here this morning. We'll see. But I want to talk about ideology and fundamentalism, what I call literalist tendencies, and dogmatism, strict teachings that are barriers to beloved community and have been for millennia. And I want to use the story of Muhammad and a few other anecdotes to make my point. And I hope when I'm done, you'll see that pluralism is possible. It's hard, but possible, and will require a new kind of post-tribalism and a kind of open-heartedness that is currently lacking in our nation. Now, Islam is fascinating to me. There are over 1.8 million Muslims in the world, second only to Christianity, which has 2.3 billion. Did I say 1.8 million or billion? 1.8 billion with a B. And there are two books that I would recommend to understand Islam better, or one book and one video. The book is by Eboo Patel. He's a sort of interfaith activist. And he wrote many years ago this book, Acts of Faith, the story of an American Muslim. And also there's an excellent documentary on PBS titled The Life of Muhammad. Both show you the complexity and depth of Islam in very honest and insightful ways. And you know, I love origin stories. So I'm a comic book guy, but not the comics when they're post into their character, but before they became who they became, right? I love those stories. And I love those not just in comics, but with great people. You know, Dr. King, you all know that. Albert Einstein, celebrities like Aretha Franklin, Sidney Poitier, religious figures like the Buddha or Lao Tzu with Taoism, or Muhammad. I love learning how people started and where they ended up, what mistakes they made, what were their foibles, and why were they so significant to the world. Now, the story of Muhammad is fascinating because he was 40 when he found his purpose. And back then, people didn't live a long time. So that was really late in life to find your purpose. And he grew up in a violent and vengeful-filled culture. This was that eye for an eye time. You do this wrong, we cut your hand off. You kill this person, I kill that person. It was a very vengeful time. There wasn't a lot of civility in this time. We have to take that into context when we read and learn about the origins of Muhammad. And where he lived in Mecca consisted of various clans or tribes led by men who led with absolute authority over their people. And Muhammad had a hard upbringing. He was poor. He wasn't raised by his parents. His dad died before he was born. So he was raised by his uncle. His mother was not able to care for him. And his uncle lived a nomadic life. So Muhammad lived much of his early life in the desert, in the traveling caravan, almost like a gypsy. But he got to see vast desert landscape, many different kinds of people, and this impacted his understanding of human beings. And he also had one advantage. He was a part of a tribe of merchants that would eventually become the most powerful clan in Mecca. But this was many years later, of course. At age 40, he was now married, working, but because he grew up in the desert, he still had a part of that asceticism in him, and he would frequently go up into the mountains to be alone, some say to pray or meditate. I assume just to get away from it all. And one night in a dark, cold, and maybe it's not cold because it's warm outside, but I imagine that even though it's warm there, it's a dark, cold cave. He begins receiving visions. Now, I'll be honest with you, I'm not putting myself on the level of Muhammad, but I have had those moments in darkness or in quiet space where things become clear. So this part of the story actually resonates with me. And in this moment, he begins to feel visions of unity, of oneness, very similar to Buddha's understanding of ultimate reality. And a voice cried to him, "There is only one God, Allah." Which is interesting because at that time, Allah was a fertility god being worshipped in the Kaaba in Mecca. But there is only one God. Now, this was in stark contrast to the people who lived in Mecca. They were polytheistic in the 500s of the Common Era. And as I mentioned, the Kaaba, the sacred cube. Muslims make a hajj to the Kaaba, the pilgrimage to worship, walk counterclockwise around the Kaaba. It was originally a place where pagans, those who were earth-based, or nature-based, or fertility-based, went to worship their gods. For hundreds of years, these sun and moon and fertility gods were worshipped there. So Muhammad's vision, although not original, because Judaism and Christianity were well established as monotheistic religions, his vision was absolutely unique for the time and place that he was in. And that message came to him: "I am the one God, Allah, and you are Allah's messenger. Read, recite." I find this story very similar to the Hebrew Bible and the Moses account. Now, if you think about this controversy and you think even what our forebears Unitarians in the 16th century did, when they came out professing that we're Unitarians, there's only one God, there's no such thing as Trinitarians, three gods, their understanding at the time, pushing back against the Catholics and the Protestants. And of course, many of our forebears were beheaded too for saying that. So imagine now, that was the 1600s, go back now to a different time. Imagine how controversial Muhammad's statement is now in that context. Not to mention that his family was selling, they were merchants, they sold lots of items to other people coming from, who worshiped various gods, who came to the Kaaba. It was their business, it was their family business. And he's saying, no, we're not polytheistic, we're monotheistic. And they got really upset with him. It was devastating the family business. So you fast forward some time now, Muhammad has about 200 followers. He's proclaiming, "I am the last prophet of God. Allah, I am Allah's messenger. There's only one God." And he's now being persecuted by his own tribe. They see him as a rabble-rouser and a false prophet. "Man, we knew you when you were young. We knew your dad. Now you're saying you're a prophet." And they wanted him out of Mecca, rejected by his own family, blocked from making a living as a merchant, ostracized, he and his people. It was hard. And then all of the tribes, including his own, got together and put together a plot to assassinate him. But he escaped, called the night journey. He escaped at night and fled into the mountains. Again, very similar to Moses going into the desert. He fled north and eventually landed upon a place called Medina, where he eventually moved all of his people. And it is here in Medina where Islam as we know it today takes shape. Now, the striking thing about Medina is that it was practicing a kind of pluralism. That's our theme this month. We don't have our little things up there anymore. But pluralism is our theme this month. They were practicing a kind of pluralism, and this endeared Muhammad to the people. In fact, he was able to build a mosque there, and there's, of course, a new mosque there, but there's a mosque there even to this day. Muhammad was able to build a mosque, live out his values without persecution. It was a happy time for him and his followers, but it would not, of course, last. Rivalries, arguments over resources, disagreements over ideology eventually led to many verbal clashes, eventually violent clashes. And some scholars say, and some disagree, Islamic scholars, that the Jewish community in Medina did not like when Muhammad moved from praying toward Jerusalem toward praying toward the Kaaba in Mecca. And some of the earth-based groups, what they called the pagans, saw his influence on converting the people in and around Medina as a problem. But even still, they managed to create something remarkable, the Constitution of Medina, crafted to keep the peace between the Muslims, Jews, and Christians and pagans. And pagans are those who follow the old earth-based religions. And the Constitution proclaimed freedom of religious practice. It was built around civility and looking out for your neighbor. It was remarkable. But it didn't last. As Muhammad grew to near the end of his life, the treaty had fallen apart because pluralism is hard and people tend to believe that their way of viewing the world is the right and only way of viewing the world. That is fundamentalism. Now, pluralism, defined by Webster, is a state of society in which members of diverse ethnic, racial, religious, or social groups maintain and develop their traditional, cultural, or special interest within the confines of a common civilization. It's a kind of democracy, but it's hard because many groups have varying ways of living, touching that elephant. Gandhi found the same problem. Muslims eat cows. Hindus revere cows. That's a big problem. And this is one example of how agreements can break down. How do we disagree without becoming violently disagreeable, Dr. King said. You see, when people are fighting for survival or for safe space or for resources and the scarcity mindset kicks in, people do not always remember to be rational or kind. The emotional parts of us, which are more advanced biologically than the rational parts of the brain, the emotional parts take over and short-circuit us, short-circuit reason, and we create bitter rivalries and enemies instead of friends and neighbors. We lose our compassion. People become threats to our survival. And here is the big thing. The heart hardens. Now, you won't hear any Muslims say this, but I can see Muhammad's heart change over the years. He was a nonviolent man for most of his life, committed to his religion. And even when he was pushed to fight to defend his people and his space and his property, he did it reluctantly. But toward the end, after years of persecution and distrust, I think he changed. And in his march back to Mecca, when he became the absolute leader of Arabia, he wasn't the same peaceful man. He had the weight of the religion and the society and the people on him. Life had changed him. He was less naive, and he was less forgiving. And this change for me has been the big thing that has impacted Islam for centuries. Those scriptures around the holy struggle, all of this comes out. This is a later version of Muhammad, which has led to a misinterpretation and terrorism and extremism in that faith. And Muhammad fought wars, and he killed people. That doesn't mean that he wasn't great. I think he was one of the top 5 great people to ever walk on this planet. But he was human. And his quest to proclaim his vision, in that quest, he lost some sense of his humanity. Now, again, contextually, it was a violent time, so it was that eye for an eye time, so I give him some grace. But for me, his willingness to conquer in the name of Islam and remove all of his enemies and what is, in fact, what turned this religion into a global power. Had he chosen the path of peace and nonviolence, I don't think it would have become as large a religion today. I'll say that about Christianity, too, by the way. Both great faiths would have probably petered out. You ever heard of Zoroastrianism? It was a big faith a long time ago. Doesn't exist now. That would have probably been Islam and Christianity. But when you build empires, they tend to last a little longer. What's remarkable is he did all of this in 22 years. Died at age 63. Some said he was having fainting spells and headaches the day before he passed. The stress was too much for one man to hold. My point this morning is what happens to the heart when it is under siege. If you don't have a spiritual foundation rooted in interconnectedness and pluralism as core values, we can easily become tribal. In fact, it is inevitable. We create us versus them. The heart hardens. And what do I mean when I say the heart hardens? I mean it figuratively and literally. When you are carrying the weight and enmity and anger, it puffs you up. It's heavy. You feel that weight. It feels like you're carrying bricks around. It can be hard to breathe and hard to sleep and hard to find optimism and love. You feel like a volcano ready to explode. The heart hardens and love diminishes. Now I'm preaching. That's what happened to the Pharaoh when Moses said, "Let my people go." Now the scripture says that God hardened the Pharaoh's heart. That's another sermon. But for us today, the Pharaoh was oppressing the people, and the plagues came. There were signs telling him enough is enough, but his heart just kept getting hard. And finally, when he was all worn down, he said, "Fine, go." But then at the last minute, his heart hardened again. He got angry. The weight of the responsibility of his leadership weighed on him. He could not fathom life after that, and so he got angry again and chased them to the sea. And he suffered even more loss, even greater loss after that. That's what happens when the heart hardens. You do damage to others, but you do damage to yourself. I'm preaching this morning. And that's what's happening in Israel today. Israel is interesting because you have the Orthodox Jews there wanting to create a theocracy over and against the more progressive Jews there who want to create a democracy, more of a secular democracy, more like what America is. And they are clashing. Entrenchment, and now trying to even remove their own Supreme Court to push this theocracy whose time has come and gone. And instead of updating and evolving, they're stuck in the past and want to keep their people stuck in the past. That's what fundamentalism does. That's what dogma. Dogma means strict teaching. That's what it does. It keeps us from beloved community. It hardens the heart. And we have to be careful, right? That our hearts don't harden toward them. That is the challenge. That we are all part of that one creative, sustaining force in the universe. And of course, the politicians here, same thing, entrenchment. It's been happening for millennia. It's not new. There's nothing new under the sun. People practicing political retribution instead of political restoration. No one wants to work together. That amygdala is firing. Rational brains cut off. Shut down. But not just in Israel and America. We have to keep our hearts from hardening from life. Now, I got 5 kids, 3 biological, 2 stepkids. I always say that because they're like, man, he made 5 kids? I made 3. But what if I did? If you're a parent, your heart can harden over your child's behavior. If you are at work, your heart can harden over that boss who keeps nagging you. Uh-oh, I spoke to somebody. If you get laid off, your heart can harden. If you had a bad medical diagnosis, your heart can harden. If you're married, your heart can harden toward your spouse. If you're divorced, your heart can harden to your ex. If you are a leader, your heart can harden from the weight of the responsibility you hold. But our way forward in this confusing and often backwards world is to remember that we can let go of that heartache, which is what I love about Islam. It means surrender. The word salam means peace. Islam, I believe, at its best, is a practice of surrendering to peace, or surrendering to oneness, or surrendering to the peace within, or surrendering to God, because all things are one, connected, as it is said, made by love for love. And if we can remember this on those heart-hardening days, then the load can lighten, the yoke can get easier, the burden can get lighter. You can say, I let this go. I'm not giving this any more power over me. What I pay attention to grows, for better and for worse. I'm not going to allow this to have any power over me any longer. And eventually, it'll come back. Eventually, you just keep saying your mantra over and over again. Eventually, there's a sweet release. And it'll be all well with your soul. That is our work today, to let go of those ideologies, identities, beliefs, creeds, or whatever that harden our hearts, and embrace values and feelings and experiences that teach us connection and love. That's how we repair our world. We can absolutely create a pluralistic democracy, but it will take time. We can create a diverse, multicultural, multi-generational, beloved community in this congregation, but it will take time. Gandhi didn't figure it out. Jesus didn't figure it out. Muhammad didn't figure it out. It will take time and evolution. Patience is still a virtue. Respond to adversity with love. Be on guard for bitterness and despair. That's what we do as Unitarian Universalists. We answer the call with love when we face exclusion. We answer with inclusion. When we face hegemony, we answer with pluralism. When we face religious intolerance, we answer with diversity. When we face narrow nationalism, we answer with global community. When we face bigotry, we answer with open-mindedness. In the face of despair, we answer with hope. That's who we are. That's who we must be. Don't let your heart harden. Surrender to love. That's lesson number one. But there's another lesson. Mindfulness. Radical acceptance of the fact that we all enter spaces we inhabit at varying stages of faith, which is so important to remember. We have to make space for difference, not be seduced by dogmatism. We all touch the elephant at differing places and spaces. Patience is required. Muhammad was a part of that pluralistic reality for a short time in his early days in Medina. It didn't hold, and it's not holding in most of our world. But we can get there slowly but surely in some generation's lifetime if we move beyond the narrow confines of our primitivism towards something much broader and greater, choosing freedom from oppression, restoration instead of retribution, love over hate. So the second lesson is radical acceptance and fighting with all you got to not advance fundamentalist principles. In 632, a short time before Muhammad died, he went on his last Hajj to Mecca. And he shared what he thought would be his last message to thousands. And I want to share a few of his last words spoken to his people. And it was clear to me that he was back to his full self after a long struggle with adversities, adversaries, and adversities. And being near to death will do that. It narrows the life, helps us see what's important. So listen to his pastoral words of unity and love as I close. He said, "O people, lend me an attentive ear, for I know not whether after this year I shall even be amongst you again. Therefore, listen to what I'm saying to you very carefully and take these words to those who could not be present here today. All mankind, humankind, is from Adam and Eve. An Arab has no superiority over a non-Arab, nor does a non-Arab have any superiority over an Arab. A white has no superiority over a black, nor does a black have any superiority over a white. None have superiority over another, except by piety and good action. Keep your heart open. Answer the call of love. Amen."